May 29, 1940. Dunkirk Beach. 180 meters from the eastern mole. Wrists bound with signal wire, under guard of 6 German infantrymen. He stood in a column of 30 prisoners, ankle-deep in surf and engine oil, while artillery fell 3 kilometers inland. He was 28, French, unregistered, no uniform, no papers. No one waiting for him on the Allied side. The guards had already decided he was finished, but they were wrong. In May 1940, he held no formal rank in the French army. Officially, he was recorded as a civilian auxiliary attached to local defense networks in the Nord Department. Unofficially, he functioned as a courier and reconnaissance asset for a loose resistance cell forming ahead of the German advance. He had been operating between Lille and Dunkirk since early May, tracking fuel convoys and mapping secondary roads for potential Allied fallback routes. When the German breakthrough cut across northern France, he did not retreat south. He moved north toward the coast. He carried no insignia, no commission, no unit patch. In occupation reports, men like him were listed as irregular elements. He had been a railway technician before the invasion, trained in signal timing, load tolerances, and switching systems. He understood schedules. He understood how movement depended on coordination. And he understood what happened when one junction failed. That background was not considered military preparation. When he first approached French rear line officers in mid-May with observations about German fuel resupply routes, he was told to leave it to those in uniform. He was asked for identification twice. The third time he was searched. His maps were taken and not returned. He continued mapping anyway. By May 24th, the Allied perimeter around Dunkirk had contracted sharply. The British Expeditionary Force and surviving French units were compressed against the coast. Resistance activity inside the pocket became fragmented. Lines of authority blurred. He tried to attach himself formally to a French infantry company withdrawing toward the beach. The lieutenant in command looked at him once and asked where his rifle was. He did not have one. He was assigned instead to assist with moving wounded toward the shoreline. He complied. He observed. He counted. He counted artillery intervals. He counted German reconnaissance passes. He counted the distance between machine gun nests along the dunes. A British NCO overheard him explaining, quietly, that the eastern mole could handle more throughput if smaller craft were staggered by draft rather than arrival time. The NCO laughed and said the Frenchman should stick to carrying stretchers. He did not argue. He continued counting. The ridicule was not loud. It was administrative. Dismissal by tone, by posture, by assignment, he accepted it without protest. On May 27th, during a shelling interval near Bray Dunes, he identified a pattern in German forward patrol movement. The patrols advanced in triangular formation, rotating lead position every 300 meters. It was efficient. It reduced fatigue. It implied disciplined command. He shared the observation with a French sergeant. The sergeant nodded but did nothing with it. That night, German units tightened their control along the inland approach roads. Prisoner columns began forming by morning. He did not resist when taken. Capture did not surprise him. He had measured the contraction for 3 days. On May 29th, he stood in a group of detainees held east of the evacuation zone. He was searched again. His pockets contained only a stub pencil, a folded scrap of tide notation, and a length of thin cord he claimed was for bundling rations. The pencil was discarded, the cord was not. The German Feldwebel, overseeing the prisoners, categorized him as civilian labor, low priority, no immediate interrogation. He listened to the guards' accents, Saxon, mostly. One Bavarian. He noted their spacing intervals, roughly 4 meters, apart along the column. He noted the direction of their glances when aircraft passed overhead. He noted that 2 of the 6 carried older Mauser variants with visible wear on the sling hardware. These were not elite units. They were efficient, but stretched. He did not attempt escape immediately. He waited. During holding, he observed something the others did not. German command vehicles were repositioning farther inland during peak air attack windows. That created temporary blind corridors between beach patrol units and roadblocks. Narrow corridors, minutes long. He did not share this observation, he stored it. Among the prisoners were several French engineers and 2 British signalmen. He identified them by hand posture and equipment familiarity during brief conversation. He asked one question quietly: how far inland were the British still holding? The answer was uncertain, possibly 2 kilometers, possibly less. He adjusted his mental map. He had one credential, no one on that. Beach recognized he had spent 6 years optimizing rail switch points under peak traffic strain. He understood how systems collapsed under overload and where the relief valves formed. The German perimeter was not impenetrable, it was overloaded. He did not yet know if he would reach Allied lines, but he understood something the guards did not. The system holding him was temporary, improvised, and operating at capacity. And overloaded systems create openings. He would have to move when the margin appeared, and if he miscalculated by seconds, there would be no second attempt. By May 29, 1940, the perimeter around Dunkirk was no longer a defensive line. It was a containment zone under compression. German armored divisions had halted temporarily, but infantry units continued tightening the inland cordon. Artillery positions were recalibrated daily. Air attacks were staggered to disrupt loading cycles along the beach. Every adjustment reduced the time window for evacuation. The Allied command faced a structural failure: too many men, too little transport, too little space, and an enemy that was adapting faster than expected. Standard procedure required holding the perimeter while rotating units toward the beach in organized waves. That system depended on intact communication lines and predictable German movement. Neither condition existed. Signal wires had been severed repeatedly by shellfire. Runners were intercepted or delayed. Orders arrived outdated. Units held positions already abandoned. Others withdrew from sectors still viable. The evacuation could not keep pace with the encirclement. And the Germans had begun identifying patterns. Each day, the same approach was attempted. Form defensive arc, stabilize inland roads, funnel units in controlled groups toward embarkation points, load by priority. Each day, the approach degraded. German reconnaissance flights adjusted altitude to evade anti-aircraft fire. Artillery shifted impact zones closer to embarkation sites during peak tide. Machine gun nests were repositioned to cut off secondary dune routes. What had worked on May 26th no longer worked on May 29th. Casualties along the inland approach roads increased sharply. Units attempting organized withdrawal were intercepted by patrol sweeps operating in flexible triangles. The German infantry did not need tanks at this stage. They needed time and pressure. They had both. French and British officers issued orders to maintain discipline, hold sectors, delay the advance. But without synchronized fallback routes, holding became static defense, and static defense became encirclement. Repeated attempts to push small breakout groups through inland gaps failed. Patrols returned fire from concealed positions. Prisoner counts increased. The system was constricting. Command pressure intensified. Reports to higher headquarters emphasized urgency without offering alternatives. Evacuation at risk if inland routes severed. Need corridor stabilization. Insufficient coordination. No one could solve the central problem. The inland corridor between German holding zones and the beach was too narrow, too exposed, and under continuous observation. Conventional solutions relied on mass and force, but there was no mass left to deploy. No armor, no air superiority inland, only fragmented infantry and civilian auxiliaries, and among them, a captured French resistance operative standing in a prisoner column. He understood something critical. The Germans were not sealing the perimeter with a single wall. They were managing flow, redirecting traffic, creating holding patterns, compressing pressure points. It was not a fortress, it was a filtration system. And filtration systems fail when disrupted from within. But disruption required movement. Movement required timing. And timing required space he did not yet have. Inside the prisoner holding zone, tension escalated differently. Guards were rotating more, frequently. Orders were shouted with less patience. The Feldwebel overseeing detainees received updated instructions twice within 2 hours. That was unusual. It meant Allied movement inland had intensified. It also meant German command expected attempted breakouts. The standard approach for prisoners was simple. March them inland at dusk, transfer to secondary holding facilities, process later. But dusk transfers required manpower. Manpower was now split between guarding prisoners and reinforcing patrol lines closer to the beach. The imbalance was visible. 2 guards were reassigned temporarily to assist a machine gun team repositioning near a dune crest. The prisoner column was reduced to 4 guards. The spacing between them widened. He did not move. Not yet. Conventional escape attempts relied on speed and panic. Bolt during confusion. Scatter toward dunes. Hope for cover. Those attempts had already failed that week. The beach was too flat. The dunes too monitored. The surf too exposed. Running toward the water meant machine gun fire. Running inland meant interception. Conventional escape was not working, so he reframed the problem. The Germans were managing traffic between zones. Prisoners were traffic. If he moved alone, he would be hunted. If he moved as part of a disturbance, he might disappear within it. He began quiet conversation with 2 nearby detainees. Engineers, older men, exhausted. He did not explain his plan. He only asked one question: how many prisoners could move at once without collapsing the column? They misunderstood him. He did not clarify. An artillery strike landed closer than expected, within 200 meters. Sand erupted. Guards dropped instinctively, scanning skyward. The column compressed reflexively. He did not run. He shifted position 2 meters left. Small movement, invisible in confusion. A second shell impacted farther inland. German voices rose. Orders were contradictory. For the first time since capture, the perimeter felt unstable. But instability cuts both ways. The same artillery that created distraction also increased German alertness. Machine guns pivoted toward the beach. The corridor inland tightened. He now understood the core threat clearly. The Allied command could not reopen inland corridors from the outside. The Germans were too adaptive. If a corridor was to open, even briefly, it would have to originate inside the filtration line, from within the system itself. That realization narrowed his margin. He would not be waiting for rescue. He would have to create imbalance himself. But this was just the beginning of the real constraint. May 29, 1940. The prisoner column had shifted 60 meters inland during artillery activity. Guard spacing had widened under pressure from aircraft noise and conflicting shouted instructions. He identified the first viable corridor at that moment. Not toward the sea. Inland, 140 meters, where a German motorcycle dispatch rider had stalled in churned sand while attempting to bypass a supply cart. The rider dismounted to clear the wheel. 2 guards redirected their attention toward the commotion. That left a 12 to 15-second interval of incomplete visual coverage along the prisoner line. He did not run. He stepped forward and collapsed deliberately. It was controlled. Knees first, shoulders next. No sudden motion. The guard nearest him cursed and approached to strike him upright. In that 3-second exchange, the prisoner column shifted again under external pressure from a new artillery report. He used the contact to roll slightly toward a depression created by shell impact earlier in the day. Depth, approximately 40 centimeters. Enough to obscure lower body profile from lateral observation. The guard moved on. He did not rise immediately. He waited through a full 10-second cycle of shouted commands and redirected rifle muzzles. Then he crawled. Not toward open sand, toward wreckage. A burned-out civilian truck lay 18 meters ahead, half buried in sand. Its chassis created angular shadow inconsistent with surrounding dune lines. Under smoke drift, visual contrast was reduced. He reached the truck, paused, counted. 4 guards remained in line of sight, but none oriented toward his position. Their focus had shifted inland. The stalled motorcycle had not restarted. He slid beneath the truck's frame, keeping parallel to the axle to avoid silhouette exposure. The sand under the vehicle was firmer, shielded from wind. He did not look back. From beneath the truck, he recalculated. Distance to dune line, 60 meters. Distance to nearest German machine gun nest along crest, estimated 120 meters. Angle of observation from that nest, shallow but partially obstructed by smoke. He could not move directly to the dunes without crossing open terrain, so he did not. He shifted laterally instead, 9 meters, from one wreck to another, a shattered field kitchen cart. Low profile, iron wheels partially embedded. Movement was incremental, 3 meters. Pause, 5 meters. Pause. Artillery sound masked sand displacement. No one shouted, no shot was fired. He reached the base of the dune line without sprinting. At the dune base, the sand gradient increased sharply. Footing unstable. Wind cresting the ridge reduced visibility by pushing smoke seaward. He angled not toward the crest, but along the slope, moving parallel to the German line rather than perpendicular to it. He needed depth inside the German-managed zone before attempting forward penetration. Halfway along the slope, he encountered the first obstacle, a strand of low barbed wire partially concealed by sand drift. He did not attempt to cut it. He lifted it carefully using a fragment of broken crate wood and passed beneath without snagging clothing. Noise level remained constant. He did not accelerate. Above him, German infantry voices shifted tone. Sharper, more controlled. A new order had been issued. Prisoner count had likely been conducted. His absence would be noticed within minutes. The margin was closing. He crested the dune only when a Stuka dive bomber pass redirected attention skyward. The dive was not aimed at his position. It created auditory cover. He crossed the crest during the second half of the aircraft's withdrawal arc. On the inland side of the dune, terrain changed. Vegetation sparse. Patches of scrub. Sand giving way to firmer soil. Craters at irregular intervals. He did not head directly toward Allied positions. He angled 30 degrees west. The German filtration system functioned by directing movement into predictable channels. Roadways, depressions, open corridors. He avoided those. He moved through uneven terrain, where motorcycle patrols would slow. At 6:12 p.m., he reached a shallow irrigation ditch. Dry. Depth approximately 50 centimeters. Running southwest, he entered it. Now he was below average ground line. Visibility from dune crest reduced further. He followed the ditch for 90 meters before stopping. He listened. German patrol voices passed above, moving north. They had adjusted. They were sweeping dune lines, not the interior. His lateral repositioning had placed him behind the first sweep arc. At 6:26 p.m., he observed the first indication of Allied presence inland. A discarded British signal cable spool partially buried in soil, cut cleanly, not weathered. He remained in the ditch another full 5 minutes to ensure no trailing patrol. Then he moved again, slowly, following the line where ditch intersected a secondary farm track. No running, no sprint. He reached a hedgerow line 400 meters inland without engagement. There, behind partial cover, he encountered two British soldiers repositioning a light Bren gun. Both turned rifles toward him immediately. He raised empty hands. No identification, no uniform. He spoke one sentence in English. He provided coordinates, approximate, of German machine gun repositioning near the eastern dune crest. He included patrol, rotation interval. He did not embellish. The British corporal did not thank him. He verified the information by glassing the dune line. Then he nodded once. The Bren gun was shifted 15 meters east. Fire adjustment followed within minutes. The German patrol triangle formation faltered under new enfilade angle. The corridor widened by perhaps 40 meters. It was not dramatic, it was measurable. His first deployment had not been escape, it had been insertion. And for the first time since capture, the inland corridor shifted, slightly, in Allied favor. But the Germans would not ignore that shift for long. The adjustment to the Bren gun position did not go unnoticed. Within 20 minutes of the altered fire angle, German patrols changed formation. The triangular rotation was abandoned. Movement became linear, tighter spacing, shorter sweeps. Machine gun nests along the eastern dune crest shifted 5 to 10 meters at a time, probing for the new firing source. They had identified interference. They did not yet know its origin, but they were correcting. The inland corridor that had widened slightly began to constrict again. The two British soldiers he had approached did not integrate him into their unit. They used the coordinates he provided, then they repositioned without instruction for him to follow. He was not part of their command structure, he remained between systems, and the Germans were now actively adapting. By 7:10 p.m., German counter-battery fire began targeting suspected Allied machine gun positions near the hedgerow line. Artillery did not strike randomly. It walked methodically across probable firing arcs. They were mapping responses. They were learning in real time. He understood that his previous success had reduced his anonymity. The corridor adjustment had exposed a vulnerability in the German pattern. That vulnerability would now be reinforced. He observed increased use of flare signals near the dunes. Red for regrouping, white for sweep. Expansion. Motorcycle patrols were reintroduced, but now paired with infantry on foot rather than operating independently. The filtration system was tightening. He faced a decision: remain near British lines and risk being pushed backward by renewed German pressure, or move forward again, deeper inside the adaptive perimeter, and disrupt its coordination from another angle. Skill had carried him across open sand. Skill would not be enough now. The Germans were no longer operating under assumption of static prisoners and passive opposition. They were recalibrating. If he stayed near the hedgerow, he would become one more irregular, attached to a collapsing edge. If he moved, he would re-enter the system that had already cataloged him once. The margin narrowed with every artillery correction. A second decision presented itself. German countermeasures were focusing on visible firing sources. But communication nodes, runners, dispatch riders, flare teams, were operating with less redundancy. He had noticed this earlier when observing patrol intervals. If he disrupted a communication relay, even briefly, patrol sweeps could desynchronize. Not for hours, for minutes. Minutes were sufficient, but disruption required proximity. Proximity required exposure. He waited through one full artillery cycle before moving again. At 7:42 p.m., he moved south along the hedgerow, using shallow depressions between fields to remain below sightline. Smoke drift had thinned. Visibility improved. That increased risk. German infantry were now sweeping interior farmland in staggered lines, not aggressively, systematically. He adjusted his route. Instead of heading directly toward a visible dispatch rider near a farm outbuilding, he angled toward a low-drainage culvert running beneath a narrow farm track. From there he could observe without silhouette exposure, He watched the dispatch rider for 6 minutes. The rider received a message from an infantry runner. Not via radio, paper, folded, hand-delivered. That confirmed something important. Not all German coordination was wireless. That created friction points. The rider mounted and accelerated north, toward the Dune Crest reinforcement zone. He waited 3 seconds, then moved. He did not pursue directly. He intercepted. The farm track curved slightly east before straightening. The motorcycle would decelerate on the curve. He reached the curve first by cutting across firmer soil between hedgerows. When the motorcycle leaned into the turn, its speed dropped. He stepped into the track, not dramatically, directly. The rider braked reflexively. In that fraction of hesitation, not combat, not struggle, he struck the rider's throttle hand with the broken crate wood he had retained from the dune wire. The motorcycle toppled. The rider fell. No prolonged engagement followed. He took the message pouch. He did not linger. He moved immediately into the culvert shadow and crossed beneath the track before nearby. Patrols could triangulate sound. The message itself did not contain strategic plans. It contained rotation orders for 2 patrol sectors, times and directional arcs. That information was enough. He altered the schedule, not by rewriting, by removing one page and repositioning it in the pouch so the order sequence would be misinterpreted under urgency. He returned the pouch to the fallen rider's immediate vicinity before withdrawing. The rider would recover. The pouch would be found. But confusion would be introduced. Not chaos. Delay. And delay was margin. By 8:05 p.m., German patrol sectors overlapped incorrectly along the interior farmland. 2 sweeps converged on empty ground, while leaving a narrow 80-meter corridor unsupervised for approximately 7 minutes. 7 minutes was not dramatic. It was sufficient. British infantry elements exploited the opening to reposition 24 men closer to embarkation, staging without engagement. The Germans corrected the error quickly, but correction confirmed something. They were reacting now, not anticipating. The system was no longer operating smoothly. It was compensating, and compensation increases strain. He had moved from evasion to interference, but interference escalates consequences. The next adaptation would not be procedural. It would be forceful, and the space in which he could operate was shrinking. By 8:30 p.m., German command understood that their perimeter disruption was not accidental. Patrol overlap errors had been reported. Dispatch timing inconsistencies noted. A motorcycle rider injured under unclear circumstances. None of these incidents alone suggested sabotage. Together they did. Search patterns changed immediately. Patrol leaders were instructed to treat the interior farmland as contested ground. Instead of sweeping in predictable arcs, units began staging controlled pauses, halting visibly in exposed areas to draw movement. Bait tactics, they left apparent gaps in coverage. The gaps were false. He recognized the shift within minutes. A patrol advanced north along the drainage line he had previously used, then stopped short of the hedgerow. They remained stationary. No conversation. No obvious purpose. They were waiting for reaction. He did not move. A second patrol displaced west but left one infantryman alone near the farm track curve, the same curve where the dispatch rider had fallen. The man appeared inattentive. He was not. The hunter had become the hunted. German forces were no longer filtering movement. They were probing for a specific irregular element disrupting coordination. They were hunting an operator, and they were narrowing their search radius. Timing pressure intensified. Evacuation along the beach was accelerating under cover of darkness, but inland pressure was increasing proportionally. The Germans intended to seal the corridor before full nightfall. If he remained inland, he risked being cut off from both sides, hunted by German patrols, and unable to reattach to Allied lines. If he attempted direct movement toward the beach, he would encounter reinforced dune machine gun positions now adjusted for lateral interference. Standard escape routes were closed. He shifted strategy again. Instead of avoiding patrol visibility entirely, he introduced controlled exposure. At 9:05 p.m., he allowed a German patrol to glimpse partial movement near the irrigation ditch. Not full body profile, just enough disturbance and scrub to imply direction. Then he withdrew in the opposite direction. The patrol responded immediately, accelerating toward the disturbance. They assumed forward flight. He moved laterally, west, using a shallow depression invisible from their approach vector. This was misdirection, not escape. He allowed them to believe they had flushed him south. Meanwhile, he repositioned north, closer to the dune reinforcement zone. Consequence for miscalculation was immediate capture. There would be no second to concealment if seen at close range. At 9:14 p.m., a flare illuminated the farmland. He froze. Full silhouette risk. He dropped flat against soil, aligning body parallel to plowed furrows to reduce contrast. The flare burned 8 seconds. 8 seconds was enough to reveal vertical motion. He remained horizontal. The flare extinguished. German patrol voices shifted direction. South toward the decoy disturbance. The misdirection held, but the margin narrowed further. German units began coordinating via whistle signals. Shorter intervals, higher pitch. Patrol density increased near dune base. He understood their adaptation clearly now. They were compressing inward toward suspected center of disruption. Toward him. At 9:27 p.m., he identified the final opening he would be given. A German officer had repositioned a machine gun team 40 meters east of its previous dune crest location to cover a wider lateral arc. In doing so, the team's line of sight to a shallow service trench near the eastern mole was partially obstructed by terrain curvature. That trench led, indirectly, toward the beach embarkation zone. It was not meant for Allied use. It was being used by German logistics runners. But at that moment, its far end was unsupervised. He did not hesitate. He moved during the next artillery detonation inland, timed, not reactive. 3 seconds after impact, when auditory disorientation peaked, he reached the trench undetected. Once inside, he remained crouched, not running, advancing in controlled bursts of 5 to 7 meters, pausing to listen. Halfway through the trench, he encountered a German supply runner moving in the opposite direction. There was no room for concealment. There was only timing. As the runner stepped forward, he pivoted slightly, using trench curvature to mask approach until the final moment. One strike to the runner's jaw with the wooden fragment. Not prolonged, not violent beyond necessity. The runner collapsed into the trench wall. He removed the runner's field cap and placed it loosely on his own head, not as disguise, but as silhouette disruption at distance. He continued forward. He emerged 60 meters from the eastern mole under partial cover of sand berms. German machine gun teams were oriented inland, responding to patrol whistle signals that had drifted south. His misdirection was still active. British naval personnel were loading men at accelerated pace along the mole extension. He crossed the final 60 meters during a lull in flare deployment. No sprint, measured pace. A British petty officer raised a rifle. He removed the field cap immediately and spoke in English before being challenged. He provided updated patrol rotation changes and noted increased whistle coordination inland. The petty officer did not question further. He redirected 2 small craft to load from a slightly adjusted angle, reducing exposure to lateral machine gun fire. In the next 20 minutes, more than 100 men boarded without direct engagement from the previously repositioned German gun team. The trench route remained viable for an additional 10 minutes before being sealed by German countersweep. By then, it had served its purpose. He did not board a vessel. He remained on the mole, providing additional patrol timing corrections until full darkness reduced visibility to near zero. The hunter had shifted again. He was no longer evading pursuit. He was shaping movement. But shaping movement draws attention, and the Germans were about to escalate beyond patrols and whistles. By 10:05 p.m., German command adjusted again. The trench he had used was sealed with 2 infantrymen and a repositioned light machine gun. Flare deployment frequency increased. Patrol whistles were replaced by tighter voice relays. The filtration system had shifted from adaptive to aggressive containment. They were no longer correcting, they were isolating. Reports moved up their chain that a saboteur or escaped detainee was operating between sectors. Orders were simplified: close the mole from inland side, cut reinforcement to embarkation point, collapse the corridor entirely. A visible gap appeared again along the western dune approach. Too visible. 2 patrols withdrew simultaneously, leaving what looked like a clear lateral route toward the mole's staging zone. It was an invitation. He did not move toward it. He watched. The withdrawal pattern was too symmetrical. Earlier patrol adjustments had been incremental. 5 meters, 10 meters, responsive to artillery or fire. This withdrawal was synchronized. That meant coordination. Coordination meant expectation. The Germans had identified the principle behind his interference: exploit overloaded junctions. So they created one deliberately. The open western corridor was bait. If he or others rushed it, machine gun teams positioned beyond the dune crest could pivot inward and cut the route from both sides. He remained still for nearly 4 full minutes, while Allied loading intensified at the mole. Time pressure mounted. Every minute of hesitation meant fewer men boarding before full German closure. He understood the trap, but he also understood something else. The Germans were compressing toward the mole to seal it from inland. That meant their rear coordination, farther east, was thinning. If they were concentrating force west, they were reducing it somewhere else. He turned his attention away from the obvious opening and scanned eastward along the dune crest. There, a secondary flare team had been left exposed during the redeployment. 2 soldiers managing signal flares and relay timing, 90 meters east of the trench closure point. Their position was slightly elevated but not reinforced. They were assuming the primary threat would rush the western corridor. He refused the rush. Instead, he moved east. Slowly, deliberately. He stayed low, using dune curvature and residual smoke as partial concealment. Each movement was flare, drew, machine gun orientation, flare, drew, machine gun orientation westward again. He used that pivot. He reached the rear of the flare position without triggering challenge. No prolonged struggle followed. One soldier was disarmed with a controlled strike to the wrist. The other was shoved into sand before he could signal. He did not eliminate them. He silenced them. Then he altered the sequence. The flare tubes were preloaded with alternating colors: white for sweep confirmation, red for sector compression. He reversed 2 canisters in their firing order. Then he waited. At 10:18 p.m., a German officer along the western corridor signaled for confirmation flare. A red flare launched instead of white. Red meant compression from east. German patrols east of the mole shifted inward prematurely, tightening on their own sector rather than holding rear containment. The machine gun teams, responding to color code, adjusted inward arc to compensate. For 6 minutes, German coverage overlapped inefficiently along the western bait corridor while thinning on the eastern approach. He moved through the newly thinned eastern arc, not running, not exploiting dramatically, crossing quietly beneath misaligned sight lines. At 10:23 p.m., British infantry elements previously stalled near a sand berm received updated guidance from a naval petty officer who had recognized the flare discrepancy. He relayed it inland. 2 platoon-sized groups adjusted approach vectors accordingly, east rather than west. They passed through the weakened arc without encountering concentrated fire. The Germans corrected within minutes. but by then more than 200 additional Allied soldiers had reached the mole staging area. The trap had failed, not because it was poorly designed, but because it had been anticipated. He had refused the obvious. He had chosen the flank behind the trap rather than the opening inside it. The decision required patience under pressure, intelligence over instinct, and restraint when speed would have been fatal. The corridor stabilized briefly under cover of darkness, but darkness cuts both ways. German command would escalate beyond flares and patrol compression. They would bring heavier reinforcement toward the mole, and when they did, there would be no more misdirection, only endurance. By 11:10 p.m., the Germans escalated. Heavy machine gun sections were repositioned closer to the inland approach of the mole. Not probing fire. Sustained arcs designed to suppress movement entirely. Illumination flares were launched in overlapping sequence, reducing the effectiveness of shadow. The filtration system was being replaced by direct denial. He had no weapon, no formal authority, no assigned sector. The wooden fragment he had carried since the dunes was splintered and discarded. There would be no more interference inland. If the mole was sealed now, hundreds still staged behind sand berms would be trapped by morning light. He observed the firing pattern carefully. The machine gun team nearest the mole was firing in disciplined 5-second bursts, pausing 3 seconds between sweeps. Ammunition discipline, trained crew. The pause was not for mercy, it was for barrel management. He waited through 4 cycles to confirm consistency. 5 seconds on, 3 seconds off. Wind direction remained northwest. Smoke from burning fuel inland drifted intermittently across the gun's line of sight, but not consistently enough to guarantee concealment. He moved during the third pause. 3 seconds is insufficient for distance. He did not attempt full crossing. He advanced in increments, timing each burst. 5-second suppression. 3 seconds movement. Down, wait, repeat. He closed 20 meters that way, then 30. A flare ignited prematurely, breaking the rhythm. He froze mid-transition, exposed. The gun resumed sweep, early. Sand erupted 2 meters to his left. He did not change pace. When the next pause came, he altered angle slightly. Not toward the mole directly, but toward a shallow ridgeline that distorted the gun's depression angle. At 11:19 p.m., he reached the ridge. From there, he did not charge. He signaled. Not with words, with motion. He raised both arms briefly during a pause. Silhouette against flare smoke, drawing the machine gun team's attention deliberately. The gun pivoted toward him. That was the point. The mole entrance corridor shifted in the opposite direction during that pivot. British soldiers moved while the arc followed him. He dropped flat before the next burst. Rounds passed overhead. He did not return fire. He could not. He simply remained where the gun expected him to rise. It did not. Confusion cost the German team seconds. Seconds were sufficient. At 11:27 p.m., the final cluster of men staged behind the sand berm cleared the corridor and reached embarkation. Craft. He did not board. He rolled downslope and crawled laterally into darkness as the machine gun recalibrated toward the now empty lane. By 12:10 a.m., he was no longer visible from the mole. No citation was issued that night. No formal report listed his name among evacuating units. British after-action notes recorded temporary corridor instability inland, possibly caused by irregular French interference. French records from that sector were incomplete. Weeks later, a quiet memorandum circulated within a reorganized resistance network in northern France. It mentioned a civilian asset who had maintained operational value under capture conditions. No decoration followed, but his role changed. He was no longer treated as auxiliary. He was consulted, not publicly, not ceremonially, operationally. At Dunkirk, hundreds crossed a narrow corridor that should have been sealed. The official histories credit naval coordination, weather shifts, and perimeter defense. They are not incorrect. They are incomplete. On May 29, 1940, a captured French resistance fighter stood 180 meters from the eastern mole, unarmed, and chose not to run when running would have been easier. Instead, he altered timing. He altered attention. He altered outcome. And then he disappeared back into the system that had underestimated him. How many operations in history turned not on force, but on one person refusing the obvious move?